All right, final presentation. Mr. Ethan Roland from the US is going to help pull us back a couple steps from the detailed examples to some broader thinking about sources of capital that might fuel a nutrient bank.
Thank you. Good morning. I work with a company called Regenerative Real Estate, which actually buys depleted farmland and uses techniques similar to what Brendan explained and also similar to some of the work of Alan Savory to repair depleted farmland, which we then sell back to farmers or lease to organic farms. I'm also the author of a new book, Regenerative Enterprise, in which I explain and develop a new economic framework called the 8 Forms of Capital. So I'd like to do 3 things today to extend and integrate the presentations that we've seen so far. First, I'm going to give you an introduction to this 8 Forms of Capital model. Second, I'm going to look at the 8 Forms of Capital on a specific example. And then third, I'll pose some questions that'll carry us into the rest of the session. First, let's define capital. Capital is a valuable resource of a particular kind or anything that can enhance a person's power to work in economically useful ways. Most of the time when we think of capital, we think of this form of capital, financial capital. This is money, currency, investments, securities. This is the form of capital that currently runs the world, and it's mainly used to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. One thing we know for sure about financial capital is that it's increasing. The amount of money in the world is increasing, in fact, is increasing exponentially, as required by the current global economic system. How can that be? How is that happening? Well, it happens for a number of different ways. A lot of our current economy is extractive and reduces what I would call the living capital of the land, either through mining or things like agriculture. As some proportion of large-scale monoculture industrial agriculture does, increases financial capital in a significant way. But agriculture is also related to another form of capital. Agriculture, by and large, has depleted a huge amount of the world's soils. 30% of all arable farmland in the world is severely depleted at this point and getting worse every day. It's actually the largest export from the United States by weight is soil, eroding off the farm fields, down the Mississippi River and out into the Gulf of Mexico, where it's created an enormous dead zone where nothing lives. Agriculture is deeply related to another form of capital, which is living capital. Living capital is the plants, the water, the soil, the organic matter, the land. This is the fundamental basis upon which all of us live and eat. This is, as it were, the principal asset for the world. However, in deforestation, in large industrial timber operations, once again, living capital decreases, financial capital increases. We see the same thing in agriculture with over-tillage, overcropping, overgrazing, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. Living capital decreases, financial capital increases. So, fortunately, as we've just seen in 2 different examples, there are forms of agriculture that can simultaneously increase living capital, increase biological diversity, soil organic matter, water holding capacity, the fertility, the productive ability of the land, and at the same time increase financial capital. To understand this more, let's look at it in terms of the whole system. Financial capital and living capital are but 2 of 8 forms. And I'll give you a quick intro to what I see as the rest of them. One that you've heard of and know of is social capital. Social capital is influence, connections, relationships. And it can be built together, it can be combined into webs of social equity and social debt. There's material capital. This is raw resources, stone, metal, timber, fossil fuels. It can be built up into plastic, it can be built up into electronics, and that further gets complexed together into structures and infrastructure. Then there's 2 that are really tightly interrelated: intellectual capital and experiential capital. Intellectual capital is ideas, concepts, knowledge. It's primarily held here in the human neocortex and also in various forms of material capital. Intellectual capital So I just read a good book on entrepreneurship, and that means that I know how to be an entrepreneur now, right? No. Experiential capital is embodied know-how. This can only be built by personal experience working with various forms of intellectual capital. What's happening right now is you're actually getting an exchange of intellectual capital, which maybe, if you want, if you're interested, you can build into experiential capital in a nutrient economy. Finally, we'll go inside, because no system is complete without looking at spiritual capital. And many religions, many spiritual traditions all over the world have some understanding of this, whether it's in the form of spiritual equity, like karma, that can be built up over a lifetime or another lifetime, or as a concept of spiritual debt. All of these 7 forms of capital can be held and developed by individuals, but there's one form of capital that can only be held by a community, and that's cultural capital. This is the shared internal and external experiences of a village, of a bioregion, of a nation. This appears in the form of story, song, and art, and is very important for the internal well-being of any peoples anywhere in the world. However, this form of capital is often liquidated in exchange for financial capital. So let's look at an example and go back to Brendan's project of Burr and Life. So in this framework, what's certainly happening is that living capital is increasing. We saw the beautiful biodiversity, we saw the improved results of water holding and productivity in the landscape. Significant amounts of that are through actually material capital changes, repairing of fences, investing in better infrastructure, so the material capital is actually enhancing the ability of the living capital to regenerate. And, importantly for this conversation, financial capital increases. For the farmers, it's the driver, partially, and for the local region. Brendan didn't mention it, but this has become a significant draw to the Burren for agritourism, to see these beautiful fields filled with flowers and the pastoral agricultural landscape. So it's creating a net economic benefit for the whole system. The farmers themselves are gaining significant amounts of intellectual and experiential capital as they learn new and old ways to positively manage their grasslands. And perhaps most excitingly to me is that overall we see a significant increase in cultural capital, and the farmers are regaining a sense of their place and their heritage and being on the land. So do you see how this framework can go around any particular enterprise we look at? We can also start to think about what are the exchanges, right? What are the exchanges that happen intra-capital, within financial capital? What are the exchanges that happen in living capital? For example, I barter some milk for a basket of fresh vegetables. That's within one form. But there's also all of these inter-capital flows. The flows between financial capital and intellectual, between living and material capital. And these flows can be used to design whole ecosystems where multiple forms of capital are created. So I'd just like to end with a few questions to send us forward. The first, many enterprises grow financial capital. In fact, all enterprises in the world at this point are required to, otherwise they don't quite make it. So just think for yourselves, which enterprises do you know of that grow multiple forms of capital and actively do that as part of their work? The second important question, we know how to invest in and receive returns from financial capital. The question for this conference and for the nutrient economy is, what does it look like to invest with other forms of capital? How do I invest living capital, and do I just get living capital back? Can I invest in intellectual capital and receive social and cultural capital as a return? What are the mechanisms to do that? And finally, we know what a financial capital bank looks like. We're sitting in one. And we know how they work. We know the mechanisms. There's a huge amount of law, intellectual, and experiential capital about how banks work. What I want to know is, what would a multi-capital nutrient bank look like? And that's the question that we'll go into for the rest of the day. I'll hand it back to David. Thank you.